Hello everyone. The War of the Roses often comes back among your topic requests. So here you are. This is what I'm going to tell you about today. The term War of the Roses is very famous, and not only in Britain, where these events took place in the second part of the 15th century, but rather in the entire world, because the War of the Roses, even though it actually happened, looks like a fascinating novel with twists, with treasons, colorful characters. It also has a historic significance because it ended with a change in the ruling dynasty in England. The Plantagenet dynasty left the throne and was replaced by the Tudors, and the Tudors in the following century especially provided famous kings and queens such as Henry VIII or Elizabeth I. But the popular success of the War of the Roses probably comes from the exciting, romantic, fanciful dimension of the story that inspired various writers since then, and just to name some of the most famous ones, there has been Shakespeare with various plays taking place during this period of the War of the Roses, or Stevenson in the 19th century, and very recently an author like George Martin with A Song of Ice and Fire, better known as Game of Thrones, based on the name of the adapted TV show, found a large part of his inspiration in the events, characters, or even sometimes side stories that happened during the War of the Roses. And, by the way, the term itself, War of the Roses, was coined several centuries later, at the beginning of the 19th century, and added to the romantic dimension of this story. Why is it called War of the Roses? Because this civil war or succession war is a conflict between two families, two houses, the Lancasters and the Yorks, for the control of the throne of England. They both used roses as symbols, a red rose for the House of Lancaster and a white rose for the Yorks. But who were these people, and why did they fight for the throne during about 3 decades, from 1455 to 1485? To understand it, we need to talk about the context and also have a look at a family tree of the Plantagenet dynasty. What is the context in the 1450s? If you know about the 100 Years' War, or if you watched the video I made about it, I will put a link at the bottom. You may remember or know that England found itself in a difficult position in the 1440s and the 1450s, actually losing almost all its possessions on the continent. The year 1453 is generally considered the last of the 100 Years' War, when, even though no peace treaty was signed, England abandoned the fight. And the loss of these territories, the incredible cost of this war that had continued for decades, had weakened the English monarchy, both politically and economically, all the more that the King of England, Henry VI, was a weak king, contrary to his father, Henry V. Henry V had had a glorious but very short reign in the beginning of the 15th century, and he had won battles such as the famous Battle of A.S.M.R in the 100 Years' War, but he died in 1422, and after his death the situation became disastrous for England in the 100 Years' War. Joan of Arc appeared in France, but on a larger scale, the opposing dynasty in this conflict, the Capetians, the House of Valois, caught up militarily and managed in the 1420s, 30s and 40s to reconquer all of its possessions on the continent. So when Henry V disappeared, the wind changed direction, and this time for good, in the 100 Years' War, leading to the abandon of this attempt of the Plantagenet dynasty to also seize the throne of France. And all of this disaster happened under the reign of Henry VI, who, on the top of that, was mentally ill and sometimes unable to rule the country, so that his wife, Margaret of Anjou, of French origin too, and powerful nobles at the English court effectively ruled the country. So in the 1450s you had a weak king who had lost a lot of credit in a country that had to acknowledge its defeat in a very long and costly conflict, and this weakened a lot the position of the crown. And it is this context that made it possible for a civil war, a succession war, to happen. But there were dynastic reasons too, and to understand them we need to take a look at the family tree of the Plantagenets, since Edward III, the king who at the beginning of the 14th century had started the 100 Years' War. The family tree is extremely complex, so this is just a simplified representation of it, but the important thing to understand is that the Lancasters and the Yorks are two branches, two houses of the same dynasty, each of them created by one of the sons of Edward III. Edward III had many children. They are not all represented here, and among his children, the firstborn was Edward, also known as the Black Prince, who fought in the 14th century on the continent in the first part of the 100 Years' War, and should have been heir to the throne, but he died before his father, and the crown went to his son, the grandson of Edward III, which was logical given the succession laws in the Kingdom of England at that time. During his reign, Richard II had no male heir, so he had an official heir found in a second branch of the dynasty, created by the second son of Edward III, Lionel of Antwerp. And the heir to the throne was a grandson or a grand-grandson of Edward III, Roger Mortimer, the Earl of March, but he died in 1398 when Richard II was still on the throne. And Richard was seen at the court as incapable, and shortly after the death of Roger Mortimer, his official heir, he was deposed by someone from the third branch of the family, the Lancasters, who came from the third son of Edward III, John of Gaunt. Because there were no heirs left from the second branch, so the Lancasters, also coming directly from Edward III, considered themselves the heirs to the throne, and Henry IV, another grandson of Edward III, became king under the name of Henry IV. His rights to the throne, the strength of his claims, were not that obvious, but during the reign of his son, Henry V, thanks to the glory and capabilities of Henry V, the position of the Lancaster family on the throne was reinforced. The rights of the Lancasters to occupy the throne were challenged in particular by the Yorks, the fourth branch of the family, the descendants of the fourth son of Edward III, Edmund of Langley, the Duke of York, and their claims to the throne were based in particular on the wedding of the son of Edmund of York with Anne Mortimer, the daughter of Roger Mortimer, this official heir of the second branch who had died before reaching the throne. As I already commented on in the video about the 100 Years' War, succession laws were always a bit unclear and subject to interpretations based on the power, the influence of various parties, so that the throne was always at risk when a king was not popular or legitimate enough to ensure his position on it. And in that case, the position of the pretendant of York, Richard, Duke of York, the son of Anne Mortimer and grandson of Edward III, is all the more favorable that he is very close to the king. He is the Lord Protector of the kingdom, which corresponds to some sort of very powerful prime minister. And in 1453, the king, Henry VI, has a crisis of madness. He becomes completely unable to rule, so that a regency council is put in place, and he tries to impose his will, his power to this regency council. And the rivalry between the Lancasters, especially the wife of Henry, Margaret of Anjou, and the Yorks, becomes military, because Margaret wants to actually have the power during the regency. Richard of York refuses and wants to seize control of the regency council, so he gathers an army, and with part of the English nobility who supported the Yorks, walks on London, and this leads to a first battle between the supporters of the Lancasters and the supporters of the Yorks at St. Albans in 1455. This is a victory for Richard of York, and he is able to impose the nomination of various allies at the Regency Council, and he actually controls this council. The Lancasters, and especially Margaret, the Queen, are marginalized. And the big question in the following month is to know who is going to inherit the throne after Henry VI did not wish to dethrone, to depose Henry VI, but he would like to see the Duke of York himself or his son inherit the throne. And the problem is that Henry and Margaret have had a son, still very young, Edward, who should be, logically, the heir to the throne of England. And Richard of York tries to get a compromise that would make his family, his branch of the Plantagenet family, heir to the throne. And the Lancasters are not willing to accept that. So shortly after, as the Duke of York is absent, the Lancasters fight back, and Margaret manages to convince her husband, who has now recovered from his madness crisis of 1453 to revoke all the nominations decided by the Duke of York. The hostilities restart, and various battles take place between the supporters of each family. The Lancasters are victorious this time, especially after the Battle of Ludford Bridge, and they force several allies of the Yorks, and in particular Warwick, a powerful noble from the north of England, to escape from Britain and find refuge in Calais, the last city that the Kingdom of England controls on the continent. But this doesn't last long, because in 1460 this Warwick and other noble families supporting the Yorks manage to invade England and establish positions in Kent. Kent is this region in the southeast of England, just in front of the continent, and they control London shortly after, making the Yorks return to the dominant position they had had a few years before. Given this military success, the Duke of York, Richard, decides to claim the throne for himself and to declare the Lancasters illegitimate on the throne. This attempt is not going to work because the Parliament rejects this, but the Duke of York manages to find an agreement with the Parliament, especially using his main argument, which is that he descends from Anne Mortimer, and then the second son of Edward III, as we saw on the family tree before, to find an agreement and to get rid of the actual heir of the throne, Edward, the Lancaster heir, and replace him by his own son, a York, who is supposed to take the throne when Henry VI will die. The Lancasters are obviously not going to accept this agreement between Richard of York and the Parliament, so they intend to continue the fight, and they're going to launch a powerful offensive attack from the north of England. Several battles and sieges take place, and this is finally in 1461 that a decisive battle, the Battle of Towton, takes place between the two sides, and this is particularly important because this is the largest land battle ever in Britain. There were between 14,000 and 80,000 soldiers participating in this large battle, probably close to 20,000 casualties, and that was a major Yorkist victory, which means that the Lancasters are now defeated, and the King and the Queen, Henry and Margaret, have to escape in exile, finding a refuge in Scotland and forced to abandon the throne to the Yorks. The Duke of York, Richard, has been killed in combat during the counterattack of the Lancasters in 1460, but he had a son, Edward, and Edward is going to be crowned King of England under the name Edward IV. For almost 10 years, until 1469, Edward IV is going to rule in relative peace the kingdom, even though the Lancasters, with Margaret in particular, have not really abandoned any hope of coming back, but she is now exiled in Scotland, and he is going to rule with the support of this Warwick that I mentioned before, later called the Kingmaker, because he's going to be extremely important in the events that will follow. Warwick was probably the most powerful man in Britain after the king, or maybe at the same level. He was also from a family of the high nobility, the Nevilles. He had very large lands, especially in the north of England, close to the frontier with Scotland, and was the largest landowner in Britain. But at the end of the 1460s, the relations between Edward IV and Warwick started to deteriorate for personal reasons, but also because Edward did not exactly do what Warwick expected. For example, Edward organized a secret wedding with a woman from the low or middle nobility, Elizabeth Woodville, in 1464, when Warwick was expecting to marry him with a French princess to seal an alliance between England and France. And as Edward is becoming increasingly unpopular, Warwick decides to make an alliance with his brother George, another York, to try and dethrone him and replace him by his brother. The conspiracy is discovered. Warwick is declared a traitor and has to escape from England, but this is going to have very unpredictable consequences, because he goes to France and he starts talking with Margaret of Anjou from the Lancaster family, still in exile, and both decide to join forces, so that the main supporter of the Yorks since the beginning of the War of the Roses is now changing side and allying with the Lancasters. But their joint offensive in 1470 and 1471 turns to a complete disaster. Warwick's army is defeated by Edward IV at the Battle of Barnet, and his army is totally disbanded. Warwick is killed, and on the other side, the Lancasters with Margaret also tried to invade in the west of England, but their attack also fails miserably, and the ancient king Henry VI is captured and killed. So the power of Edward IV in 1471 is now reinforced, and he will rule until his death in 1483. But this is not the end of the story, because when he dies in 1483, the logical successor should have been his son, Edward V, but his son is only 12 years old. He had two sons, actually. One was 12, the other was 9, and the brother of Edward IV, Richard of York, too, who was in a very strong position. He was the Lord Protector of England, seized this opportunity to become king instead of his nephew, and he managed to make the two little princes, the sons of Edward IV, to be imprisoned at the Tower of London, where they died mysteriously, and became king as Richard III. But his reign is going to be rather short, because the Lancasters have not abandoned every hope of coming back, and after the death of Henry VI, who was for them the legitimate king, death that happened in 1471, they had moved their hopes to Henry Tudor. For the Lancasters, Henry Tudor, from the Tudor family, was legitimate to become the king, because he descended from a half-brother of Henry VI, but more importantly, by his mother, he was a descendant of John of Gaunt, the founder of the Lancaster house. And militarily, this time, things are going to turn in favor of the Lancasters, because from the summer of 1485, Henry Tudor gathers supporters in Wales in particular. This is where his family came from, and meets the York army and crushes it at the Battle of Bosworth Field, in which Richard III is killed, which opens the door for Henry Tudor to become King of England, which he does under the name of Henry VII, and he is the first Tudor king of England, putting an end to several centuries of ruling by the Plantagenets, even though he also had Plantagenet blood in his veins. But this is the moment when the Tudor dynasty reaches the throne, and as I said at the beginning, it would be associated in the following century with particularly interesting periods of the history of England. So here we are now, in about 30 years from the beginning of this opened rivalry between the Yorks and the Lancasters in 1455, 30 years have passed with fightings, with twists in this never-ending war, and a new dynasty is now at the head of the country, and this time it will not be disputed, at least internally, for a very long time. The consequences of the War of the Roses, apart from all this romantic and spectacular dimension that it has, are quite important politically too. Economically, not that much, apparently, because the two families had no interest in ruining the economy, and most of the time they preferred to sort their rivalry out on battlefields with relatively quick battles, and the land was not devastated during this period. But politically, this probably corresponds to the end of feudal times for England, very much like France, about which I talked about in the video about the 100 Years' War. Through this process of internal fight, the political power and influence of various noble families was not destroyed but checked, and this helped build a more modern state. But externally, this 30 years long rivalry has made that England was without a strong diplomacy outside, was paralyzed internally, and this civil war was a period of decline for the influence of England after a 14th and early 15th century that had been much more favorable. And this is why one of the main axis of the policy of Henry VIII, the second Tudor king, would be to try and restore the influence of England outside and turn it again into a relevant kingdom on the European scene. But this is another story, and maybe I will have an occasion to talk about it another time. So this is going to be all for today. I hope you liked this video and that it was understandable despite the complexity of these dynastic stories. As usual, your comments and topic requests are very welcome below the video, and I hope to see you soon for another topic. Bye bye.